was in the middle of a deposition when my phone buzzed against the conference table. I ignored it the first time. The second time I flipped it face down. The third time I excused myself. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but the area code was Tucson. I stepped into the hallway and picked up. "Is this Neil?" The man's voice was measured, careful. Not the voice of someone delivering bad news exactly. The voice of someone who had decided, ahead of time, how he was going to say a thing. "It is," I said. "My name is Alvaro Reyes. I'm the contractor your brother-in-law hired to convert the garage, the one that belonged to your wife." He paused. "I need you to come out here. Not today, I understand you're not local, but soon. And I need you to come by yourself." I stood in that hallway for a few seconds after he finished talking, watching a paralegal push a cart past me without making eye contact. "Can you tell me what this is about?" I asked. "Not over the phone," he said, "but I promise you, it's something you need to see. My name is Neil Sherwood. I'm 53 years old. I'm an estate attorney in Phoenix, which is a profession that teaches you, over time, that people are rarely as straightforward as they appear, even the ones you love. My wife Joanna died 2 years and 4 months before that phone call. She was 49. The doctors told me it was a cerebral aneurysm. Sudden, catastrophic, no warning signs they could have caught. She was at the grocery store. She was reaching for a can of crushed tomatoes on the third shelf, and then she was on the floor, and the woman in the next aisle over called 911, and by the time they got her to Banner University, she was already gone. We had been married for 22 years. After Joanna died, I stayed in Phoenix. Joanna's family was in Tucson. Her parents, her younger sister, her brother-in-law, who managed a landscaping company. Her mother especially had been close with her, and when Joanna died, her mother aged 5 years in 5 months. I drove out to Tucson on most weekends that first year just to sit with them, to eat dinner and not talk about it directly, which is its own kind of talking about it. Joanna's family had kept her childhood home after her father retired. A single-story adobe on the east side of Tucson with a detached garage her father had used as a workshop for most of his life and then, when his hands got bad, had handed over to Joanna on her visits home. She had used it for painting, watercolors, mostly, though she kept a small oil setup in the corner. She was not a famous painter. She painted because it was the one place, she told me once, where her brain went quiet. After her mother passed 18 months after Joanna, the house went to her sister, who lived 40 minutes away and had no use for it, and decided to convert the garage into a small rental unit to help offset the property taxes. The contractor she hired was Alvaro Reyes, who had been doing similar work in that neighborhood for almost 20 years. I drove to Tucson on a Thursday. I told my assistant I had a family matter. I told my brother-in-law, Joanna's sister's husband, a man named Ted, that I wanted to see the renovation before it was finished, that it felt important to see the space one more time before it became something else. He understood, or he said he did. He offered to come with me. I told him I needed to go alone, not yet knowing why Alvaro had asked that, just knowing that I would honor it. Alvaro met me in the driveway. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, dark hair going silver at the temples, a measuring tape clipped to his belt and sawdust on his forearms. He shook my hand with both of his. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You didn't leave me much choice," I said, not unkindly. "No," he said. "I don't suppose I did." He led me through the side door of the garage. It smelled the way it always had, mineral dust and linseed oil, and something faintly sweet that I had never been able to identify and had always associated simply with Joanna. The walls had been stripped to the studs on 2 sides for the new electrical and insulation. In the back corner, the corner Joanna had always used for her oils, Alvaro had pulled out the built-in cabinet she had installed herself about 6 years before she died. "We were disconnecting the cabinet to relocate it," Alvaro said. He stopped at the wall behind where the cabinet had stood. The wall behind it is not original to the structure. Someone added it maybe 20 years ago, framed it in, drywalled it. There's a void space behind it, about 14 inches deep. When I cut into it for the new wiring, I found this. Tucked into the void, sitting on a small piece of plywood that had been screwed into the studs to make a shelf, was a canvas bag, the waterproof kind with a roll-top closure. The kind Joanna had taken on the rafting trip we did on the Colorado River in 2009. I recognized the bag before I recognized what it meant. I haven't opened it, Alvaro said. I figured that was yours to do. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. I thanked Alvaro and asked him to give me some time. He nodded and stepped outside without another word, and I stood alone in the garage that smelled like my wife and unrolled the top of the bag. Inside, there was a spiral-bound notebook, a portable hard drive, the small rectangular kind, charcoal gray, a Ziploc bag containing what looked like a medication bottle, no label, with maybe a dozen capsules inside, and a letter in an envelope, sealed, with my name written on the front, her handwriting. I hadn't seen her handwriting in over 2 years. I sat down on the concrete floor. I didn't open the letter first. I don't know why exactly. I think I wasn't ready. I think some part of me understood that once I read it, something would change, and I wanted one more minute in the world where I didn't know what was in it. I opened the notebook instead. Joanna's handwriting was hurried in places, deliberate in others. She had been left-handed, and she always smudged the ink if she wrote too fast. And I could see the ghost of that on some pages, the faint blue smear along the side of her hand, and just seeing it did something to me that I am not going to try to describe. The first pages were methodical. Dates, figures, short notations. She had been tracking something. I had to read 3 pages before I understood what. Joanna and I had separate finances for most of our marriage, by choice and by preference. She had her own savings, her own investment accounts, her own CPA. She had always been more financially cautious than I was, which I had always attributed to having grown up in a family that had been through a lean period when she was a teenager. I knew the broad strokes of her accounts, not the details. And she had never asked me to know the details. About 30 months before she died, someone had made 2 withdrawals from her primary brokerage account totaling just under $40,000. Both were described in the transaction records as advisor-directed rebalancing. Her financial advisor was a man named Spencer Holt, who had been managing her accounts for 9 years. She had gone to Spencer first. This was in the notebook, dated clearly. He had told her the withdrawals were a portfolio adjustment, pre-authorized under the fee structure she had agreed to at the time of the original account opening. He produced a copy of the agreement. She had produced her own copy. The language was different. Hers did not contain the clause he was citing. His did. She had written in the margin, different documents, same original signature. How? She had gone to a second advisor, not to transfer her accounts, not yet. Just to get a second opinion on whether the language Spencer was citing was standard. The second advisor told her it was not. She wrote, "Not standard." Never seen phrasing like this. He said it felt custom inserted. Over the following year and a half, she had documented 6 additional withdrawals. The total approached $110,000. I put the notebook down and walked to the side door and stood in the sunlight for a minute. Alvaro was sitting on the tailgate of his truck at the far end of the driveway, looking at his phone, giving me space. I went back inside. The entries changed partway through the notebook, not in what she was tracking, but in the texture of the writing, tighter, more urgent in places. She had started feeling unwell, headaches that came and went, a persistent fatigue she couldn't explain given that she slept well and wasn't overworked. A neurologist had found nothing structural. Her GP had attributed it to stress and perimenopausal hormonal shifts. She had accepted that for a while. Then there was an entry, about 8 months before she died, that stopped me. The supplements. When did I start taking them? Check the calendar. I remembered the supplements. Joanna had been disciplined about her health in a way I had always admired and slightly envied. She took her vitamins on a schedule, tracked her sleep, ran 4 days a week, but the specific supplements she was referencing, a set of capsules, a blend for cognitive support and cardiovascular health, something she had mentioned in passing, and I had never thought twice about. I could not immediately remember where they had come from. The notebook told me 4 entries later. Spencer had given them to her at their quarterly portfolio review about 19 months before she died. He had mentioned he had started taking them himself, that his wife had done a lot of research into the brand, that he thought Joanna would appreciate them given how careful she was about her health. He had brought 2 bottles to the meeting. She had said thank you and thought nothing of it. I read that entry twice. Then I read the next one. I stopped taking them 3 weeks ago. The headaches are less frequent. I don't know if this means anything. I need to be sure before I say it out loud. Then, 2 weeks after that, I had one of the remaining capsules analyzed. I used a lab in Albuquerque, paid cash, gave a fake name. I didn't want a paper trail yet. The technician called me back and said she found something she couldn't fully characterize without more sophisticated testing, but that there was a compound present that had no business being in a supplement marketed for cognitive support. She used the word anomalous. She said I should pursue further testing. Then the line that I have not stopped thinking about since, I know what I need to do. I'm just afraid of being wrong. I'm more afraid of being right. I turned to the last pages of the notebook. The final entry was undated. Her handwriting was different from the earlier entries. Still hers, but looser, like she had written it quickly or at a point when precision was harder. Neil, if you're reading this, you found it, which means I ran out of time to tell you myself. I'm sorry for that. I kept trying to find the right moment and the right words and enough certainty, and I never got there. I want you to know that the reason I didn't tell you sooner was not that I didn't trust you. It was that I was afraid of what it would do to you to hear it before I had proof. You carry things heavily. I love that about you, and I knew this would flatten you, and I wanted to be sure before I handed you something I couldn't take back. I know now that was a mistake. Please take the capsules in the Ziploc bag to a forensic lab, not a commercial supplement testing service, a forensic toxicologist, and please, whatever you decide to do next, don't do it alone. I folded the notebook closed and sat with it in my lap for a while. The light coming through the garage's high window had shifted from the flat white of mid-morning to something warmer, more angled. I had been sitting in there for a long time. I opened the envelope. I won't reproduce everything she wrote. Part of it is private, in the way that 22 years of marriage is private, the particular shorthand of people who have known each other long enough that certain sentences carry more than their words. But the relevant part said, Spencer gave me the capsules at the November meeting. He brought them in a small paper bag with a ribbon on it. He said it was a gift, that he wanted to do something nice for a client he genuinely respected. At the time, I thought it was kind. Now I think about the fact that he knew I ran in the mornings, knew my sleep schedule, knew I was disciplined about taking supplements daily. He knew they would get used. I don't know if what I'm thinking is true. I need you to find out. The hard drive has copies of everything. The account statements, my copy of the original agreement, the lab report from Albuquerque, and a recording. I recorded the last meeting I had with him, in person, in his office. I wore a blouse with a pocket, and I put my phone in the pocket, and I hit record before I walked through the door. I know that was a risk. I know Arizona is a one-party consent state. I looked it up. I drove to a Best Buy on the way back to the highway, bought a portable hard drive reader, and sat in the parking lot of a Panera and opened the files on my laptop. She had scanned everything. The account statements going back 3 years. Her copy of the original agreement alongside photographs of the pages Spencer had cited, which her copy did not contain. The lab report from Albuquerque, 2 pages, written in clinical language, but the relevant line was clear. The submitted sample contains trace concentrations of a compound consistent with the cardiac glycoside class of substances. Concentration levels at observed dosage frequency may be insufficient to cause acute toxicity, but could, over a sustained administration period, contribute to progressive autonomic dysregulation in individuals without a pre-existing cardiac history. I read that paragraph 4 times. Joanna had no pre-existing cardiac history. The aneurysm had presented as sudden and unrelated to any chronic condition. That is what the doctors had told me. That is what I had believed, because I had no reason not to believe it, because no one had told me to ask different questions. Then I opened the audio file. It was 51 minutes long. The ambient sound was the particular quiet of an office with good insulation, the soft hum of an HVAC system, the faint sound of traffic below, the click of a cup being set on a glass desktop. I recognized his voice from the 2 times I had been to their joint meetings, measured, confident. The kind of voice that made you feel like you were the one who didn't quite understand the room. Joanna asked him about the withdrawals. She was calm and specific. She cited the transaction dates, the amounts, the language used. Spencer pushed back, gently but persistently, suggesting she might be misremembering the onboarding process, that managing an investment portfolio required latitude that clients sometimes found counterintuitive after the fact. He said the word counterintuitive 3 times. Then Joanna said, "Spencer, I had one of the supplement capsules you gave me tested." There was a silence, not a short one. 7 seconds. I counted. When he spoke again, his voice had not changed in pitch or pace, but something else had changed. Something underneath the tone, like a door being quietly closed. "I think you should be very careful about drawing conclusions from unofficial testing," he said. "I'm not drawing conclusions," Joanna said. "I'm telling you what I did." "Joanna," a pause, "you've been under an enormous amount of stress. I've seen it. Anyone who knows you has seen it. I think you should talk to someone, a professional." "I'm saying this as someone who cares about you as a client and as a person," Joanna said. "I hear you." And then the recording ended. 7 seconds of silence after she told him the capsules had been tested. That was his response. Not confusion, not offense, not the instinctive protest of someone who had given a friend a wellness gift with no knowledge of what was in it. 7 seconds of calculation and then a pivot to undermining her reliability as a witness to her own experience. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. I am an estate attorney. I know how to build a case, and I know the difference between evidence and proof, and I know, better than most people who have not spent their careers in the legal system, how hard it is to take what you know to be true and make it demonstrable in a way that matters. I also had 22 years of understanding that Joanna did not say things she was not sure of, and she had been sure enough to record a meeting, to hide a bag in a wall, to build a file on a portable hard drive and leave it where she believed I would eventually find it. I called a colleague, a woman named Dana Frisch, who practiced criminal law in Maricopa County and whom I trusted completely. I told her everything, start to finish, parked in that Panera parking lot with my coffee going cold. She was quiet for most of it. When I finished, she said, "Neil, don't contact him. Don't tell anyone outside of immediate family. Bring me the hard drive, the notebook, and the capsules, tomorrow." I drove back to Phoenix. The following morning, I sat across from Dana in her office and laid everything out. She reviewed the files while I watched. When she got to the audio recording, she listened to the relevant portion twice. Then she looked at me. "I'm going to contact a forensic toxicologist I've worked with before," she said. "And I want a financial crimes investigator to look at the account documentation before we go to the state AG's office. I don't want any gaps." "How long will this take?" I asked. "Don't think about time right now," she said. "Think about doing this right." The forensic toxicology analysis took 6 weeks. The lab was in Scottsdale, affiliated with Arizona State University's Forensic Science Program. The report was 12 pages. The substance found in the capsules was identified as a synthetic cardiac glycoside analog, not identical to any commercially regulated substance, which was, the toxicologist explained to Dana and me in a phone call, likely intentional. It was close enough to cause the physiological effects associated with the class, but different enough to evade standard toxicology screens of the kind done during a routine autopsy when cause of death appeared obvious. Joanna's autopsy had not involved expanded toxicological screening. There had been no reason for it. The aneurysm was present. It was real, and it was catastrophic. What the toxicologist explained to us, carefully and with appropriate qualification, was that sustained exposure to cardiac glycoside compounds in someone with no pre-existing cardiac history could, over time, create the conditions that made a cerebrovascular event more likely. It was not a guarantee. It was not a simple equation. But it was not nothing either. "You're not going to be able to prove causation to a criminal standard," Dana told me the night the report came in, on the phone, after I had read it twice. "I need you to understand that now. What we may be able to prove is poisoning with intent, and we can let the criminal standard for the rest develop from there. But I don't want you walking into what comes next expecting a certain outcome." I told her I understood. Spencer Holt was arrested on a Tuesday in April, 14 months after Joanna died. The charges filed initially were securities fraud, theft over $10,000, and administration of a harmful substance. The investigation took an additional 9 months. What it turned up beyond Spencer's own activities was the part I had spent the most time sitting with. Joanna had a cousin, her mother's sister's son, a man I had met maybe a dozen times over the years at family gatherings. A quiet, unremarkable presence at Christmases and the occasional summer barbecue. His name was Roger. He had been, for several years before Joanna died, in financial difficulty. not the kind that shows on the surface. He still had his house, still had his job in logistics, still showed up at family events with a bottle of wine. The quiet kind. The kind that accumulates in the spaces between what you earn and what you owe. The investigation determined that Roger had introduced Spencer to Joanna 9 years earlier, which I had known. What I had not known was that Roger had, approximately 3 years before Joanna died, gone back to Spencer with information. The size of her accounts, roughly, the fact that she reviewed her statements closely, the fact that I was not involved in managing her finances. He had told Spencer these things in exchange for money, a series of small cash deposits, irregular enough to look like personal loans, that the financial crimes investigators traced back through 2 intermediary accounts to a holding account Spencer used for purposes unrelated to client management. When the investigators interviewed Roger, he said he hadn't known what Spencer intended to do. He said he thought Spencer was going to find a way to redirect some funds that Joanna might not catch. He said he had needed the money and had told himself it would even out, that no one would get hurt. He said he had not understood how far it would go. I have known Roger the way you know a cousin-in-law. Distantly, politely, well enough to shake his hand at Christmas. Well enough that Joanna would have had no reason to suspect he was the source of a leak in her financial life, and so she hadn't named him in her notebook. Hadn't known, had suspected Spencer directly without understanding how Spencer had known which questions not to ask. Joanna had protected me through the whole of it without knowing who she was protecting me from, which in some ways makes it worse. Roger accepted a plea agreement. Accessory charges reduced for full cooperation with the prosecution against Spencer. Spencer was convicted on the fraud and theft charges. The charge relating to the administration of a harmful substance resulted in a hung jury on the first trial and a conviction on the second, 7 months later. The sentencing was what it was. Dana had prepared me, and still it was not enough preparation, because the gap between what the law can demonstrate and what you know to be true is a gap you cannot close by understanding it intellectually. You just live on one side of it and keep going. The civil litigation Dana referred to a colleague who specialized in financial fraud. It took 2 years and it recovered most of the stolen amount plus damages, which I directed partly to a scholarship fund at the University of Arizona's art department. Because Joanna had talked once about wanting to take a formal class there, but never having made the time. I still practice estate law in Phoenix. I still drive to Tucson on some weekends, less often now that her parents are both gone, but her sister is still there, and we have dinner, and we don't talk about all of it directly, which remains its own kind of talking about it. The garage renovation was completed. I went back once to see it. It's a tidy little studio now, neutral colors, new flooring, a small kitchen against the south wall. Nothing left of the paint, smell, or the linseed oil. Alvaro Reyes did good work, as he had clearly done good work for 20 years. And the space is now something a stranger will fill with their own ordinary life, which I think is probably the right outcome. In the letter Joanna left me, the full letter, there is a line I come back to more than the others. She wrote, "You have always been better at trusting people than I have. I used to think that was a weakness. I don't think that anymore. I think it's a form of generosity. But generosity has to come with eyes open. Please keep giving people the benefit of the doubt. Just don't give them your eyes." I have thought about that distinction a great deal. Between trust that is generous and trust that is blind, between being open and being willfully unaware, between caring for someone and caring so much that you stop paying attention to what is happening around them. Joanna had been paying attention. She had been paying attention while she was sick and frightened, and increasingly certain that something was being done to her that she could not fully prove. She had documented it methodically, in a notebook she kept in a bag behind a wall, in a recording she made with her phone in her breast pocket, in a hard drive that she assembled with the same quiet precision she had always brought to everything she did. She had been trying to hand me a torch that she knew she might not be able to carry to the end. I think about her in that garage, setting the canvas bag on the plywood shelf she had built, rolling the top closed, replacing the cabinet, going back into the house and making dinner, and not saying anything, carrying it alone. I wish she had told me. I understand why she didn't. I have spent 2 years holding both of those things, and I think that is just where they live, side by side, without resolving. She was the most careful person I have ever known. She trusted the truth more than she trusted comfort, which is harder than it sounds. She was also right about everything. I keep coming back to the image of her rolling that canvas bag closed in the corner of the garage. Alone, in the quiet, probably in the early evening when I was still at the office. Setting it on the shelf she had built herself. Replacing the cabinet. Walking back into the house. Making dinner. Joanna was not a dramatic person. She did not perform her feelings, or announce her suspicions, or ask for credit for the things she quietly endured. And I think that is exactly why what she did was so extraordinary. Because it cost her something enormous, carrying it alone, and she did it anyway. Not for herself, but to make sure I would be protected after she was gone. What Spencer did had a logic to it. The cold logic of someone who believed that intelligence without conscience was a tool, rather than a corruption. He was smart enough to construct the fraud, smart enough to obscure the paper trail, smart enough to choose a substance that would not appear on a standard toxicology screen. But that same intelligence also convinced him he was untouchable, and that is where his thinking failed him. He underestimated Joanna. He mistook her quietness for passivity, her trust for blindness. He gave her the capsules because he believed she would simply take them and not ask questions. She asked every question. She wrote them all down. Roger is a harder thing to sit with, because Roger did not think of himself as someone capable of participating in harm. He needed money, and he told himself a story about what the money required, and he kept the story small enough that he didn't have to look at the full shape of it. That is not unique to Roger. That is something most people are capable of, under enough pressure, with enough need. The difference between people who act on that capacity and people who don't is not always intelligence or circumstance. It is whether they are willing to hold themselves to account for the full consequence of what they're doing, not just the part they can live with. Joanna held herself to a standard. I am still trying to understand. She was frightened, and she was sick, and she was, I think, more alone in those final months than I will ever fully be able to reckon with. And still, she documented. Still, she recorded. Still, she thought carefully about what I would need, and how I would need it delivered, and what I would have to be protected from in the absence of certainty. That is not just love. That is a kind of moral clarity that most people never have to summon because they are never asked to summon it under those conditions. I think about what she wrote, "Don't give them your eyes." I have turned that sentence over for 2 years. What she meant, I think, is that generosity toward people, the open good faith kind, the kind that assumes the best, is not something to abandon. But it has to coexist with the willingness to see clearly, to notice, to sit with discomfort when something doesn't add up, rather than smoothing it over because the alternative is too painful to consider. She did that. Even when it cost her everything, she kept her eyes open. She kept her records. She stayed clear when clarity was the hardest thing available to her. That is the thing I carry forward. Not bitterness, not suspicion, not a closed-off version of myself that treats every relationship as a liability, but the willingness to pay attention, to ask the second question, to trust people fully and still, quietly, keep my eyes open. She earned that understanding for me. The least I can do is live by it.